Are we good? Welcome, everybody. Welcome to Detroiters Speak. I'm very happy to be here. I haven't been able to be here, and it's like being back with family. So I'm appreciative of being back in the space and being with people that I love and whose work I respect. I could say that because prior I was working by myself, and I go back and forth on whether I love or respect myself. But I'm here with a group of people that I know that I love and respect. So I'm happy to be with you tonight. We have a good conversation coming up. And admittedly, I haven't followed as closely as possible because I teach on Wednesday nights. And when I can get off Zoom or YouTube, I try to. So I haven't been keeping up as much as I would like. But I do want to kind of like flesh out kind of what the series is about before I hand it over to our guest speakers today. Of course, the series that you're a part of is called Detroiters Speak: Pandemic Politics from Lockdown to Liberation. And there have been a couple of panels already. I believe Craig said this is the third of the series out of six. And tonight, the subtopic is cops, protests, and robber barons. And we're going to focus primarily on kind of like policing and the notion of, and I know Peter Hammer, who some of you have met before, has talked about, altering our conception of what it means to police, right? And that frequently, the term is more punitive. And he has, I know on our campus at Wayne State has talked about even shifting the notion of criminal justice, which is a bit of an oxymoron in and of itself, to kind of like public safety. And I would say that, that's a turn in the right direction, but it also presents its own problems. And this gets to kind of like the core of what we've been talking about in here, which is like the framing of kind of systemic racism as a public health crisis and the limitations and the strengths perhaps of that approach. So I want to begin by just kind of laying out some things that I think are important. The first thing I want to do is kind of talk about the robber baron aspect of it, because it often gets overlooked, I think, during the pandemic. So many of us are just trying to survive, right? Trying to go from Zoom class to Zoom class and deal. I know I'm dealing with depression, right? Just from kind of like the long situation that we're in. And it's kind of it's easy to lose sight of kind of like the big picture and what's going on structurally in this country and across the world. And while everybody's been suffering and millions are unemployed and millions face evictions and, 500,000 people have lost their lives, right? In the midst of all that chaos, the wealthiest of the wealthy are vastly expanding their wealth, right? Whether it's Jeff Bezos and Amazon, or even now the oil companies are on the come up again. We have billionaires who are profiting off the misery that's taking place. And I wanted to point that out because it's important to mention, uh, Naomi Klein talks about crisis capitalism, right? How people take crises and then profit off it. And we're seeing that at this very moment, right? And just locally, to give you an example, of course, is Dan Gilbert, who I think began this crisis with about 7 billion estimated, which is a lot of money, but it's not hardly as much money as the 47, 48 billion that he's now kind of associated with now that he's taken Quicken Loans public, right? So while thousands upon thousands of people in Detroit are facing eviction, and we had an eviction recently on the west side that I want you all to be mindful of, right? People are getting evicted, and they're not only getting evicted, they're getting evicted with police assistance, right, for these evictions. So this raises a whole bunch of questions about the role of policing, right? And it's an ever-present topic, of course, but sometimes we underestimate even their scope, right? So they're kind of like the armed guards, if you will, of the eviction process, and have been doing so while people are trying to stay healthy. And as you can imagine, getting kicked out of your home in the midst of a pandemic doesn't make the public any safer, right? So we have to call into question kind of the notion of, are police associated with public safety? And what would public safety really look like if we imagine it for ourselves, right? We have existing institutions that claim these mantles, oftentimes for funding, right? But we have to be real cognizant of what that means. We have to envision what actual public safety will look like. So then we could make claims to make and demands to make that a reality. And I put that on you, the students in here, to envision a better world, like to know what you're fighting for and to visualize what the world could look like. So I would encourage you after listening to this to think about that. Uh, you know, Public safety as a term, right, makes sense because we think about police as serving and protecting. At least that's what they tell us that they're supposed to do, right? We always like to ask the question is, what do police really do? Do we really need police? And if so, kind of what do we need them for? I just want to float that question out to you to think about it, because I would guarantee you that if you really start breaking it down, and many of the things that we associate kind of the need for police for, right, that if you really think about it, they don't need to serve in the multiple capacities that they do, if at all, right? And I think that's important to think about. I believe last week, and correct me if I'm wrong here, but I think the issue of policing, kind of like the immigrant population, was addressed, particularly through ICE, right, and the violence of ICE through forced sterilizations, through the breakup of families, right, to having the trauma of being hunted all the time. I live on the east side, so I could tell you this. I drive by ICE offices all the time, and I've never seen more people there than I do now, right? And during the protest last year, of course, they were nowhere to be found. They'd park 2 blocks away and walk because they were scared, right? But now they're in full force, despite what you hear Joe Biden's doing to ICE or whatever. There are people in those offices all the time milling about. Uh, so, kind of as a follow up to kind of like last week, it's an extension of that in the sense that we're going to be looking at kind of like policing both protest against kind of like the violence of the state and of the police, right? And for Black Lives Mattering, right? Or Black liberation, right? Which are all interconnected. So when we think about BLM and Black Lives Matter, of course, during the late 60s and early 70s, right? BLM stood for Black Liberation Movement. And I would argue to you that both are the same. They're a continuation of a similar idea. To make Black Lives Matter means Black people need to be liberated, right? And I think that's critical to note. Let me just speak briefly before I hand it over about like the public health crisis and policing, right? And where I think kind of like problems exist within this framing, even if we use kind of like the term public safety. Oftentimes, these terms are manipulated by the state and police as a means to gravitate or garner more resources, right? So the police take multiple kind of like rhetorical approaches, right? They tell you that if they didn't exist, right, the world would be in chaos, number one, right? And so you have to fund them. But when people started to talk about systemic racism being a public health issue, they started to reframe policing in terms of public health, right? So we would talk about a pandemic and we would talk about coronavirus, right? Whereas to them, they oftentimes frame gang violence as a pandemic or gun violence as a pandemic, right? The difference is that when you're talking about something epidemiologically, right, the idea is to get to the root, right? The root of the problem. Like, you're trying, if you have a disease, right, or some health problem, you don't just treat the symptoms, you deal with the root. The problem is, of course, when the police use these terms, they always want to focus on the most immediate symptoms. And those symptoms, as they portray them, do harm and violence to Black communities and Black people and families, right? So I'll just give you a couple of examples. There are a few operating. Some of you may have seen the movie The Interrupters, right? Which is about a group that was initially called Ceasefire out of Chicago, Illinois. It started in Boston, but it's probably most famous for dealing with the epidemic of gun violence in Chicago. And they very clearly pursued a public health approach in search of their funding, right? And ultimately that program got shut down for the misuse of funding, right? And across the country, we see ceasefire programs, which were supposed to be detached from the police, become captured by the police departments themselves and are used as a means to kind of like add on to the, vast resources that they already draw upon, right? So they ultimately switched their name in Chicago. Here, we still have ceasefire, and they make no bones about it. It's not detached from the police department at all. They work directly in conjunction with them, right? In Chicago, they switched the name to Cure, right? Just to show you kind of the connection between kind of the propaganda that they put forward and the ways in which they manipulate language as a means to get greater resources to continue punitively policing Black communities. Okay, so we have a further epidemic, right, that needs to go, that needs to be addressed, and I want to talk about it in those ways to understand that the way that the police and the state use this notion of public health is often manipulative to kind of continue or carry forward the policies that people are protesting against, right? We have in this city an epidemic of police violence, right, and police murders that habitually get declared justifiable homicides, right? And to me, we have to go to the source. And the source of this is, who do the police protect? And that brings us back, of course, to the robber barons, but it also brings us back to the city and the state and the police themselves and the utter lack of accountability, right, that they have, right? And so to deal with the problem at its source, however you say that word, because I probably can't get it twice. I got it once, so I'm proud of that. But anyway, to deal with the source, we have to really attack that at its base. And I would argue to you that the base isn't even the police chief, Clayton Bigsby. I mean, James Craig. The source of this is really, Mike Duggan locally, right, who seems to hide from this issue, right, and put it all off on his Black police chief very conveniently. So I just wanted to kind of open up with that because A, I've been thinking about it, and B, I wanted to kind of complicate this notion of, policing as a public service or a public health issue, right? So with that, I'm just going to be quiet from now until the question and answer period comes. Please put your questions in the chat. I'll keep track of them as we're going, and I'll select them for the session later. But I want to turn it over to Yusuf Shakur of Community Movement Builders, and then we'll go to Lloyd Simpson and then Nakia Wallace, the latter two of Detroit Will Breathe. Yusuf?
So I'm just doing an intro, or
let me clarify. I just want you to speak on that topic and your history with that topic and your feelings about kind of what needs to be done, but also kind of the propaganda that the police put out here about, this notion of keeping the public safe, and ceasefire, if you would, a little bit too.
Okay. All right. My name is Yusuf Bunchy Shakur, native Detroiter. So I greet you in Detroit language, or what up, though. A lot was just said. I'm gonna make a few distinctions. One, the Black liberation movement, Black liberation itself. It's a lot of confusion around that terminology and that theology, because of the relationship to social justice. So some of us perceive or function within Black liberation from a social justice nonprofit perspective. That is not Black liberation. Black liberation is the act of defining Blackness towards self-determination, towards our independence, again, in this society, because of the opposition to white supremacy and the whiteness of the society. Some perceive it as hating white people. It is hating oppression. It is loving the freedom of Black people and loving the ability for all people to be free, but understanding the historical context and dynamics of the oppression that was imposed upon Africans. And when we say Black and Africans, our terminologies are interchangeable. Making the distinction between Black Lives Matter and Black liberation as a concept, as a motto, it's relatable. As an organization, is not. Making those distinctions, that's another conversation. So within that framework, you have organizers that was born out of the direct oppression here in America, who saw it for what it was. It was, police in our communities, occupying armies. And I'll just start like with the Black Panther Party, who organized themselves in resistance to police brutality within our communities. There was numerous organizations that had done that type of work. Example, Deacons of Defense and down south, who organized to protect civil rights organizers, leaders against racist Klansmen. Again, many of us tend to forget that the Klansmen, there was Klansmen at night and police officers during the day. So you still have that same type of mentality. As you fast forward it, we don't see necessarily the same brutality in the way we see it now because of the cameras. It's always there. When you're a kid, you walk and you get caught up at certain times of the night or on certain streets, police knock you upside the head, or you and proceed in certain activities. They put you in the car and drive you somewhere. You may make it home, you may not. I mean, it's just a rule of thumb. And the way the police have always operated within our communities and households and when they came in, as if they was God, as if that no one was there to check them or no one could. And so when you associate that with someone such as and I think Craig and Hollywood Craig and Duggan are joined by the hip. I don't think Duggan is that smart, and I know Craig is not that smart. I think they're smart together out of their dumbness, in my opinion. And they hide behind each other. And the reality of it is, Craig tends to say that he has a good relationship with the police, and that relationship is based upon the manipulation of those who are perceived Detroit as a high crime area. I'm not here to debate that. What I'm here to debate is the circumstances what create the criminal activities in the city. Is a direct result of the lack of. When you have the lack of, your first desire is to provide for yourself. That's the first law of nature. And so as a result of that, if I don't work a job, if you can't give me an honest job, I work a dishonest job. I mean, this is the nature of criminality within Black and brown communities, in particular Black communities. I grew up in an area where you can find a crack pipe, a crack, and a gun quicker than you can find a literacy book. And it wasn't by accident. That shit was like non-laters in our neighborhoods at some point. And then the ability to during the 80s, when minimum wage was less than $5, and you got guys the merger of crack cocaine, you can get paid between $300 $500 a week. And then it's called a per diem. You make $2, $3-4 off each rock you sold. I mean, this is you had young people, just people in general, who was locked out the economic system here's the means that you can make more money than your fucking parents could, and began to buy the latest Jordans, during that time, the Calvin Klein, the Bill Blast, all these fashionable things that become addicted to. And within this, this is policing. Policing is policing that situation. Back in the day, the police, I think it's the 10th or the 12th police precinct on Livernois and Amherst. They're saying that it was more dope sold out of that precinct that was ever sold out of any drug house. I repeat, they said it was more dope sold out of that precinct that was sold out of any drug house. Same way, I went to prison. I went to prison for a crime I didn't do. There will be a news that report about drugs in prison, but they would never tell you how I got in prison. I mean, you can't have no level of criminality in prison without guards. It's impossible. Same thing on the streets. You can't have no level of criminality without the police engagement. And all this is, why is that? It is tied to capitalist society. And what I mean by that is, in this capitalist society, there's a value on money. There's a value on social status. We know police are very underpaid. So if you're underpaid and your job is kicking your ass, and you're going and you're arresting or you're engaged in so-called a war with individuals, when you knock them off, they got more money than you probably would see in a lifetime in what you perceive. And so, and you don't have the right values, and your values is to get over, then you begin to take a little off the top, and then you begin to engage in a certain way, because it's easy, because this is what the economic system is. It's competitive. It's for every man for themselves. So this is this cat and mouse type of game. But what happens is the individuals who are victims of the system get blamed for the criminality that has been imposed upon them. And so policing is nothing but there as an occupying army to protect state, protect property. There is no relationship between them and the community because here in Detroit, they don't even live in the community. When they took the forget the policy out, when they removed that, they many of you guys who live in your neighborhoods, think about it. More likely, and where you come from, the police officers are 2-3 generations that lived in your community, lived in your neighborhood, or live close by. So that they had a different orientation. But when they come into black communities, based upon what they've been fed, the way I look, oh, he's a thug because he wears his hat, it's kicked to the side. He has on blue jeans. His pants, I may couldn't find my belt today, and because of that, my pants ain't fitting. Or he's sagging. He got to be a drug dealer. I mean, these things that they hold on as if they're the Bible. In terms of description of black people, and in particular black women and black men, there's different levels of description of how they perceive us and how they interact. And I just conclude on this about a month and a half ago. It was a gentleman in my neighborhood. He was riding his bike, and mind you, in our neighborhood, we wasn't fortunate enough to get the bike lanes, like in certain areas of Detroit on the streets and stuff. And so there was this guy. He was riding his bike on the wrong side of the street, and it was snow on the sidewalk, trying to get to wherever, and the cops pulled him over. It's obvious what it is. It's you just rationing this guy just because. And I engage in the conversation with him because I'm a member of my community. What they say, you see wrong, you speak up about what's wrong. And the officer, well, we see him as a suspect. Suspect for what? Riding a bike? No, he's riding on the wrong side of the street. Like, when is that a crime? And you talk to any officer, they'll tell you they can pretty much pull you over for anything. They can pull you over for having something hanging from your dash. It's numerous stuff. Like, and they'll tell you if they did that, they would never get anything else done because they would just continue to pull people over. So most of them, they use enough common sense, like, I'm gonna just let this pass. But for this particular day, they did. And the reason they didn't, my neighborhood, like similar neighborhoods in Detroit, is designated as a crime area. And anytime that as a crime area, everybody in that neighborhood is perceived as a potential criminal. But also, again, relationship to Wayne State, relationship to the Newsom area, relationship to this is what happens when you have lopsided communities, when you have lopsided neighborhoods. So we look like criminals versus when you cross the other sea. So let's protect the other side against these individuals, and it perpetuates this fear. So bringing it back full circle, when you have a group like the Black Panther Party and others who are not only defending the community against police brutality, but they're defending humanity and communicating that to people that you have a right. This is the basis of Black liberation. I'm not waiting on you to tell me I have a right to live free. That is my God-given right to live free. And I'm going to live free as a Black man, as a Black woman, as a Black child, by any means necessary, and even if it means is in opposition and confrontation with crooked police. Oh.
All right. I'm going to move on now to Lloyd. But Yusuf, I'm going to come back to you with some questions because you had a lot there. So I thank you for it, but I'm going to come back to you. I'm going to start the questions. This is my prerogative as the facilitator. So I'll be asking you some questions later. But Lloyd?
Thanks, G. So I want to talk about policing in the context of a very particular event that happened this past summer on July 10th when Detroit police murdered Hakeem Littleton. And I want to start with a quote from Hakeem's aunt, Noiso. You have to ask yourself why, and you'll get to the root cause. And policing has a very particular function, of course, broadly, but particularly in the city of Detroit, it's been very detrimental to the public health and safety of working class Black people. In the poorest big city in the nation, 30% of the budget goes to the police. Detroit has 220% of officers per capita as the state average. The city spends roughly $600 on policing compared to just under $100 per capita on public health. And in 2016, the city spent $547 per capita on police, while that same year, per capita spending on food stamps in Michigan was less than $21. Police operate a very specific function within the system of capitalism, and that is social control of poor and working class Black people. And so the murder of Hakeem Littleton and the events that followed on July 10th, it had a profound impact on me personally and on the movement more broadly, and laid bare the long neoliberal project of dispossession and criminalization of working class Black Detroit. And so, you know, to understand what happened on that day, it's important to have historical context in terms of the trajectory that brought Mike Duggan and James Hollywood Craig to power. So, you know, the advent of the modern carceral state, the racist drug war, that actually all began with so-called liberal Democrats under Lyndon Johnson, who signed the Law Enforcement Assistance Act in '67, and then the Omnibus Crime Bill in '68, which was really a response to the specter of Black rebellion. Because at this time, you know, Black people were rising up and claiming that self-determination that Yusuf was talking about earlier. And so, you know, all of this federal money going to police and the militarization of local police forces was predicated primarily on manipulated crime statistics, the supposed crime wave that was happening across the nation, and particularly in cities like Detroit. And so concurrent with that, you have deindustrialization in a city like Detroit and capital flight to the suburbs. So increasingly over the following years, what you're left with is a surplus working class population in the city of Detroit that no longer, that white capital no longer had a use for. However, you know, people are going to make a way in whatever way they can. And so, you know, people engage in underground economies to feed their family, to get by in a world when there is no more jobs in manufacturing, there is no more opportunity for working people in Detroit. And so, you know, by the close of the 20th century, Detroit sent more citizens to prison than any other city in Michigan. And the percentage of Detroit families living below the poverty line was almost more than 72% higher than the state average. So, you know, and I say all this because, you know, white capital had a very particular design for Detroit. You know, Mike Duggan came in, you know, under after emergency management, in which Craig was appointed by Kevin Orr during emergency management, and Mike Duggan kept him on. But they had designs on Black urban space. And so, you know, you see the transformation in downtown, you know, as a, you know, result of speculation, real estate speculation, and a renewed interest by white people in urban space. But what happened in Bagley can be traced directly to an expansion of that project. And so, like, why you have hyper policing in an area like Bagley is because they have, you know, this concept of the new Detroit. They have designs on these outer lying neighborhoods now. Now that they've gotten finished with downtown, they're moving into these Black urban spaces in the outer lying neighborhoods that have where you have like depressed real estate value, and people have been you know, forced from owning their homes. You have a lot of people renting. And so they got designs on that. And so, you know, like what happened to Hakeem is a direct result of that. So gang squads show up, you know, they murder Hakeem, and later a video comes out, and you know, allegedly he has a gun and fired on the police, and so suddenly his life is expendable. Well, his life was expendable because of the class position in which he occupied, and that's what it comes down to. And so, you know, it's interesting because, you know, throughout this past summer, there's been this narrative of the outside agitator. Well, on that day, it was the community that came out and was demanding accountability for the murder of Hakeem. And the police reacted in the way that they were trained to. They actually responded exactly the way that they're supposed to in a system of capitalism, which is repression. And so, you know, the community is demanding answers, accountability, badge numbers, you know, the release of any body cam and dash cam, and you know, the police go wild on the community and protesters. And you know, the thing is that you know, like there hasn't been an instance previously where a video was released that quickly. And part of the reason that video was released was to quell any prospect of Black rebellion. Because on that day, like, you know, that possibility was there. And so, you know, what you have in Detroit, unfortunately, is, you know, Craig is willing to do the dirty work of Duggan. You know, I agree with G and Yusuf. It's really, you know, this is really the, you know, Duggan at the forefront of this, but, you know, James Craig is more than willing to do that dirty work. But you got to look behind that, you know, because yes, it's white capital and white speculative interests that, you know, that are responsible for that, but also complicit in that and actively supporting that is a Black political elite and business class in the city that's willing to sacrifice the poor and Black working class, you know, to benefit from the desires of white capital. So, you know, like in terms of like policing, policing, like, you know, there isn't any reforming policing because policing is operating exactly the way that it was intended. And, you know, it's incumbent upon us, you know, in the Black community and people who care about the project of Black liberation or are invested in that to understand that, you know, that, you know, like reforms and, you know, accountability, you know, okay, that's all fine and good in the short term. But at the end of the day, like, you know, Detroit doesn't need another $40 million added to an already bloated police budget. What we actually need to do is defund that budget and bring that money back into the community for the things that Black people actually need in Bagley, you know, and across the city, which is money for housing, education, and healthcare. You know, I mean, like I cited some statistics earlier about, you know, the spending on public health in the city. Like, you know, Detroit is approaching $400 million. 30% of the city's budget is spent on police. And so, like, if we really want to realize the project of Black liberation and for Black people to have self-determination, that's going to start with returning those resources to the Black community.
Thank you, Lloyd. Thank you, Lloyd, in case you didn't hear that before. I'm going to get to you in a minute too, but let's move on to Nakia, and then we'll get to the Q&A. I don't have many questions yet, so students, please ask some questions. We have a good panel here who's given you a lot. Ask some questions, and it doesn't matter if you don't know what they're talking about, ask about it. You know, if you do and you want some clarification or you disagree or whatever, ask about it. But in the meantime, Nakia, are you with us?
I'm here. My name is Nakia Wallace. I am a co-founder and an organizer with Detroit Will Breathe. I'm also a proud Detroit girl. And so I was asked to talk a little bit about policing as a public health crisis. And I think that there are, a few examples that we can draw from, right? But really, policing is a public health crisis because not only is it state sanctioned like violence in the way that it literally leads to the murder of people, it's also state sanctioned and funded like terrorism in neighborhoods. And so I think there's a few clear examples that I'm going to give. So there was a federal program called Operation Legend or Relentless Pursuit, which meant that there would be resources to deploy federal agents into communities across the nation. And what their job would be is to handle the rise in crime and to relentlessly pursue criminals. Well, what we know about that program is that what it did, and anytime that there's been any type of like federal surplus of federal agents going into Black and Brown communities, it has led to terroristic raids. It has led to a multitude of stop and frisk, and nothing that really resolves crime and increase in crime, but certainly results in an increase in terror throughout neighborhoods. So they found out that in Chicago, what was happening was massive stop and frisk as a result of Operation Legend and Relentless Pursuit. Even really using the funds to hyper surveil people who had previous interactions with the police. So in one case, they just followed a man who had been arrested on a misdemeanor. They followed him around until he parked his car 6 inches from the curb, and I guess the rule is it has to be 12 inches or something crazy. And then they arrested him on that. And so it's under the guise of preventative policing, right? Which is essentially like we just criminalize a bunch of people and we hyper surveil them. And it's similar to what Yusuf was saying about like when you're in a particular place, they just do whatever they want to do. But it's really is a program of terror that's being dispensed down in neighborhoods. And so Operation Legend and Relentless Pursuit happened before, the funds were set and they were requested by local police departments before the pandemic, but it was dispensed and it was heightened in the middle of a pandemic in which the communities that those federal agents went to really needed other things like healthcare, really needed COVID efforts to be vamped up. But instead of the federal government spending those funds on helping those communities and helping the people who live in those communities, they spent it on hyper terroristic policing measures. And so the need or I don't know how to put it. The investment in policing always comes before the needs of Black and Brown people in their communities. And that just has been true throughout this country. I think another really good example, Professor Goldberg spoke about it a little bit, but we see the case of Miss Whitney Burney, who in December, 2 weeks before December of 2020, right before Christmas, she is evicted by the Detroit Police Department. So the Detroit Police Department has stated publicly over and over again that they do not carry out evictions and that they have a policy against it. So Miss Bernie and her 4 children are given 15 minutes to throw everything that they can into garbage bags, and then they're drug out into the streets. Miss Bernie at the time was unemployed, and she really did not have anywhere to take her children. This is a public health crisis because it means that Black women and Black children and Black people all over are being thrown into the middle of a pandemic at the hands of the state, at the hands of the police. I think there are other examples. I mean, July 10th is always interesting to talk about and to consider. Lloyd, that's his day, man. That's the day. That day means a lot to him. And the thing about July 10th is that it was the second major arrest for our organization, Detroit Will Breathe, of the summer. And July 10th was so we had got arrested on June 2nd. July 10th and June 2nd really underscored, both of those days underscored, and I'm sure Yusuf could talk better about this than me, but the nature of incarceration does not necessitate public health. I mean, it's not amenable to the needs of public health. In fact, it has to be set up in a way that's counter to the health of the people that are incarcerated. So what we saw was, first of all, there weren't, most of the officers did not have masks. They didn't have gloves when handling us. We were thrown onto buses. There was no social distancing on these buses. When we got to the jails that we were taken into, there were no temperature checks. There were no real measures to keep us safe, right? And when I went to, what's it called over there it doesn't matter. But in the jail, I was thrown into what they refer to as a bullpen. And in the bullpen, there were 6 of us. Now, there was no COVID measures. Nobody gave us a mask. There was not any soap. There was a sink, but there was no soap. There was not enough room for the 6 of us that were in there to put our mats 6 feet apart. The mats were not cleaned off beforehand. I know they weren't, because when I was getting released, they told me to throw my mat back in the pile, and nobody cleaned it off. So there really were no precautions, even in the jails, right? And so I'm sure that that's heightened. Those have to be heightened in places where people have longer stays, like prisons and like county jails. So that's really important when we talk about not only the way that the police have become a public, they've already been a public health crisis, but they've heightened, or they've become even more dangerous to Black and brown people in the middle of a pandemic, because everything from the way that your community is surveilled and policed right down to every single second of that interaction is extremely dangerous for your health. And so you think of like me, fortunately, I was fortunate enough to be able to get out when I got out of jail and go take a COVID test that next morning. That's likely not the case for the majority of Detroiters who end up in jail who don't have access to healthcare. So we have this turning wheel, and so in a pandemic, it's extremely egregious. But honestly, in the day-to-day life, it's egregious. The jail, where is it? It's on Mount Road, had an outbreak of like TB, and they had signs about it that there was an outbreak in the jail that day. So there's this outbreak of TB alongside a pandemic, and so those, I don't know, I wanted to kind of highlight those things. And then we get to August 22nd, which was a day where we were arrested on Woodward, sorry. I know y'all like, you don't remember when you got arrested? Listen, it's been a long year. So, August 22nd, we were arrested on Woodward. And this is again in the middle of a pandemic that disproportionately affects Black and Brown people. And we're held outside of there's no social distancing. We're thrown on these buses. We're held on the buses until 4 a.m. I had to pee on, I mean, there's no like gender segregation or sex segregation. We're all on the buses together. We're sitting next to each other. I had to pee on an integrated bus because they wouldn't let us out to use the restroom. And so people had to squat and do what they had to do. When we got to the jail, we were held outside until 10 a.m. the next day. So from 4 a.m., I mean, and we had been heavily maced and pepper sprayed, which we know has an adverse effect on your respiratory system. So we're held outside, it's freezing. And then when the sun comes up, it re irritates the pepper spray that's on your skin. And there were no measures to get, to address the needs. Nobody's coming out at the jail and patching up your skin. So I think I don't know, that's what I wanted to say on that. I know that I had a few more notes. I'm sorry, bear with me. I think also it's just inherently violent. What we see is like police departments in New York and other places spending millions of dollars on Teslas and new cars. We see the renewal in perpetuity of the facial recognition contract in Detroit. And all of this is happening in the middle of a pandemic. And so what it means in no uncertain terms is again that the investment towards resources for police always kind of come before the immediate needs of Black and Brown people. We have people in the city of Detroit without running water. We have people in the city of Detroit without electricity. We have children. We have most vulnerable populations. And the city of Detroit knows this. How do we know they know this? Because they do shit like, on the coldest day of the year, they offer, they open up two warming shelters, right? So that they know that this is a problem and that these people are out there, yet and still we're spending $40 million on policing. We're spending most of the budget on policing. Throughout the pandemic, 30% of students in Detroit public schools, community district, we have to say that now, community district, just didn't log on. They just weren't engaged with their education. And we know that my school district, this is a district where already the majority of the students are 2 or more grade levels behind. And so instead of taking funds to address that issue and to figure out how can we solve this crisis happening in the public schools, what we get is the renewal of a facial recognition contract. What we get is, Chief Craig requesting federal agents to come in for Operation Legend and Relentless Pursuit. And the truth is that police always say public safety, right? What public safety looks like is in order to help people stay at home, we're going to have people come and bring you groceries every week. What public safety looks like is, listen, we need to divert all of our funds and resources and manpower to the people who are struggling the most. So that means we're not going to do any we're not going to pursue any nonviolent crimes at all because it's a fucking pandemic going on. But instead, they chose to focus and hyper focus on what they could do to seize the moment, right? Like there's massive unemployment in the city already, but even more people are unemployed. Even more people are restless. The kids are home from school. We got massive amounts of Black and Brown people just sitting in some of these neighborhoods in squalor and despair. So they took the opportunity to really seize the moment and inflict even more terror down into our communities than they already do. I'm done.
All right, we're going to leave it open for some questions. We have some good ones, so I'm going to start off with a few things and maybe some directed questions, and I'll go to the questions from our audience. But I wanted to raise a few things. Just hearing you talk brought up some issues to my mind, and I wanted to kind of like give some local context to some of them. One thing is Lloyd mentioned, I think that the police budget is over 30% of the city of Detroit's budget, right? And this touches on some of it. Some of it goes to the bike lanes that Yusuf was talking about. That's very small, right? A large proportion of the city's budget goes to both police and firefighting, right? Because they've gutted social services. Lloyd mentioned the era of neoliberalism, and that's the impact of it, is basically getting rid of as much social support as you can in favor of civil defense, which is what they used to call it, rather than public safety, right? And that's important to note that part of that bankruptcy was a mandated restructuring of how the city, spent its money, and to prohibit the city in some ways from making allocations that would help the people. And beyond that, it's very important to note, you mentioned Operation Legend, Nakia, is that the city budget itself is very hard to track because so much of it comes from federal resources. So I want to hip you to a group, and I don't think many people know about this group because they kind of like lurk in the shadows like Ra's al Ghul, if you'll get my Batman reference. But it's the Detroit Crime Commission, right? And this is a clearinghouse of federal grants and surveillance, right, that impacts the city of Detroit. And it's run by the former head of the FBI locally. His name is Andy Arena, right? And they've kind of farmed this out on a like public-private relationship. They actually run like gang surveillance through this body, yet it's not accountable to the public at all, right? And a lot of the fiduciary responsibility comes through that institution, as well as a group called Black Family Development, run by a woman named Alice Thompson, right, who funds in part financially Ceasefire Detroit. And I bring that up just to kind of illustrate something that I was talking about before. I used to show my class this picture of the scene from the day that Hakeem Littleton was killed. And I was standing right next to his family, right? And they had signs and they were fired up. They were angry and pissed, and rightfully so. And they wanted to know what the fuck was happening. And one of the things that is important for all of us to know, and those of us that want to fight against these things, is, as Mao used to say, you have to be able to identify your enemies, right? And I had a picture that showed people that were focused at the moment that Nakia was being put in a chokehold, which I believe the police later called a two-handed restraint, right? But she's clearly being choked. And I was there and I was asking the police, I was like, you have a duty to intervene. Somebody is choking Nakia right there, right in front of you. And while that was happening, there's a photo, and I wish I had it for you, but there's a gentleman named Malik Shabazz, right, who evokes the fucking Black Panther Party, who used to fight against the police brutalizing Black people, who evokes Marcus Garvey, who fought for Black liberation globally, right? Not on a radical means, but for Black people to have self-determination, as Yusuf was talking about earlier. On a global scale, right? And while Nakia's being choked, he's not filming Nakia being choked by the police. He's filming the protesters, right? Why? We got to ask ourselves who people that are being set up as representatives are being paid by, right? And they will obfuscate how people are getting paid and things of that nature. But we have some false leaders. And this gets back to kind of something that was talked about earlier, right? You have to be able to identify people who are allowing themselves to be used in a comprador role, right? Meaning who do the bidding of the powers that be. And as Lloyd mentioned, they're doing the bidding of capitalists who are profiting off of this, right? And we have to be clear about that. And we have to be able to understand who is on the people's side and who is pretending to be on the people's side, and who is betraying the people, right? That's very important. That's kind of why I brought up ceasefire before, because I see this as a funding mechanism for the police to expand itself even further than we realize, right? And I think that's critically important because besides the 33 some odd percent of the budget, there's even more money going in that we're not able to track because they don't track these nonprofits, right? And some of them are so brazen they don't even file tax returns because they know nobody who matters is looking for them, right? So that gets me to a question that was posed, and I'll kind of throw it in here right now. But someone asked, Yusuf and Lloyd had alluded to the role of nonprofits in the dynamics of oppression in Detroit. And this person wonders if you could expand on that. And before I throw it over to you, I should mention that I know this has been a recent topic, but there's the Reverend Joan Ross in the North End, right? Who has been kind of complicit in the kind of eviction of people within that community. And I don't mean this, I mean this to say that like it's important to understand the relationship between the nonprofit industrial complex and efforts to co-opt grassroots movements. So I want to throw that out to you and to see your feelings about kind of the role that nonprofits play in Detroit, the oversized role. Yusuf, would you tackle that or?
Sure. So to add some context, and again, I refer to the Black Panther Party. In the context I want to add, I think was 60, 69, going to 70 when the American government does Head Start program, which it tailored itself after the Black Panther Party in terms of programming. They created the free breakfast program for children. They made a commitment to abolish or to eliminate poverty and whatnot. So within this framework, it was creating this dependency and saying, well, we'll do this for you. There's no longer a need for a Black Panther Party or organizations such as that. So it emerged as this contradiction within the community. And also the contradiction is within the framework of, I mean, most of us who side on the left, who side as nationalist revolutionaries, there's not a lot of places we can go knock on the door or submit a resume and say, hey, can you hire Nakia? Hey, can you hire Lloyd and Yusuf, right? So in reality, we live in, like Lloyd and myself been saying, we live in a capitalist society. So how do you take care of yourself? And unfortunately, for some of us, we find ourselves working within a nonprofit industrial complex, which is acknowledged as a contradiction. But within that, there's those individuals who are designed, I repeat, who are designed by structure to operate in a certain way. And within that, even many of you guys are in a higher education. You're at Wayne State, you're at University of Michigan. I'm at Union Institute working on my PhD. The question that I have for us, how are we educating ourselves? Are we allowing ourselves to be educated to come out to think the way we want, the way they want us to think, but are we coming out with a critical lens of cleansing ourselves of not just being patriotic Americans and functioning on behalf of the state? And that's what happens, because they say hell is paved with good intentions, and this is what a lot of these nonprofits do, because again, they become gatekeepers. They become pacifiers. I had a great fortune of in the first segment we talked about Cure interrupters. I met them early on. Great relationship. Again, the contradiction within that framework was, do we fund the police or do we fund interrupters? Same thing in Detroit. Do we fund nonprofits? Black family development and a lot of these where they position themselves. I mean, and just use this brutal analogy. It's like overseers. When you think about the plantation and how they created certain system, and so oppression is very sophisticated. I work within the same thing. Craig and Dave, they working within the framework of academia. How do you tiptoe? That comes back to your values, comes back to your principles and whatnot, and what they are. But we have to be clear on the roles and how they function within that system, which is, are you really on behalf of people, or are you on behalf of the system and the state? And so I would recommend many of you guys to watch the movie Spook Who Sat by the Door. There's Dan Freeman, the main character, who works in the nonprofit industrial complex at the time, but uses it for the means. And it's a fictional movie, but it's very real. It's very real in terms of real life. And at the end of it, his friend is a police officer, and they have this very dynamic conversation. Like, you cannot be Black and also be an officer, in the sense of you have to choose one, because if not, they're going to make you choose one.
I want to say something to just brief. Nonprofits can't replace the state. They cannot do the job of the state. They should not try. But what they do in existence is they seem to, or purport to, mitigate the damages caused by the state, right? And not only that, they I don't know they absolve the state of their crimes, because now when a disaster happens, you're not saying, damn, why is the federal government not stepping in to fix this problem? You're like, well, these nonprofits are trying, they just don't have the funding. So what they do, the way that, like Yusuf was saying, how they position themselves is really to be fire hydrants and to stop movements and to slow down anything that attempts to hold the state accountable for their crimes and their harm and their neglect, and really the violence that the violence and harm that they do to communities. And so we have issues that are like issues of major, like homelessness. And you have people in the community being upset that the nonprofits aren't solving this issue. Detroit has more nonprofits than anywhere in the world. That's a fact. Google it. So if they could solve our problems, it would have been solved 20 years ago. They can't. No institution can replace the state. What they can do, though, is slow down movements that seek to hold the state accountable, that seek to replace the state. So that's really important to understand. And when we understand the nature and the role of policing is the enforcement arm of the state. That's what the police are. They're not like everyday people who want to do good. The police as an institution is the enforcement arm of the state. So that's really important. Sorry.
Lloyd, do you want to address that, or can I run my jibs?
What do you think, G?
I just want to say that, we look at nonprofits, and the thing to realize here is that one of the things that happens with nonprofits is they pick winners and losers, right? And so oftentimes the people that get funded, right, are those that will capitulate to the demands required for funding. You very rarely see grassroots organizations get funding. And when they do, and I gave the example before, but it's usually in certain areas in which people have now been tied into having kind of like their institutional base is relying upon that funding, right? And so then all of a sudden they can get their hooks in and kind of dictate policy, right? So in the North End, for example, gentrification has been a project since the bankruptcy, right? Since, banks controlled the vast real estate in that area, and they then can have a say in what direction that nonprofits will take in that area, right? And it's an important connection to policing too, because when areas are gentrified, right, two of the things that tend to happen is schools in that area, neighborhood schools will get centralized, oftentimes in downtown areas, right? So there's no more community cohesion around institutions, which we see broadly in the city of Detroit, right? But you also having hyper policing of those areas. And this gets to something that Lloyd was mentioning before. And I'll just try and make this analogy between schools and policing quite quickly in hopes that Lloyd will talk about it. We used to have a college called Mary Grove College on 6 Mile, not far from the area that this took place, the murder of Hakeem Littleton, right? This was captured. There's very valuable land. It's adjacent to some of the most wealthy areas in the city, right? and they closed down Marygrove, which used to teach working class people and give them an opportunity towards careers like social work, teaching, and things of this nature. In fact, they even had an Institute for Detroit Studies, right, which was a progressive kind of program. Used to, Elena Herrera from Southwest Detroit used to play a major role in it, right? And they basically gutted that institution and took that land, and they're going to make like kind of magnet schools out of that area. And so corresponding with that, right, is an attack on areas in which have a primary kind of home ownership base, but there are segments of that community that are kind of like filled with renters, right? So it's no surprise that the area where Hakeem was and where he had previous encounters with the police who previously had threatened his life, right, was in one of these hyper-policed areas that was kind of prime for gentrification, right? So Lloyd, if you could just talk about Hakeem's experience and try and let people know who Hakeem was a little bit, because we're talking about things as abstractions. This was a young man, you know, or a boy, quite frankly, he's quite young, right? You know, younger than many of you, right? And he has a family, right? So if you could speak to that a little bit, I'd appreciate it.
So yeah, as G was saying, Hakeem was a young man with aspirations and family and goals just like any of us. But the problem is that, he didn't fit the mold of what white society demands of us. He wasn't willing to conform in terms of like cultural assimilation to the norm, to the norms of white society. And so that kept him locked out of a lot of opportunity. And the thing is that, without that, without conforming to, the white normative structure, there just isn't a lot of places to go for a young Black man in the city of Detroit. And so, he gets swept up like a lot of young men do by the police. Like that interaction, which resulted in his death, was one of many interactions that he had with the police. Many young Black men have with the police in neighborhoods like that in the city of Detroit. And so, when you don't have opportunities, when you're shut out of the things that you would like to do, because like Hakeem had interest in, working in trades, but we know that the trades are very racist. Like there's a lot of, racial nepotism in the trade. So it keeps Black people from being able to be a carpenter or able to, to do whatever in the trades. So, whatever Hakeem was doing, he was doing because he needed to survive, and he needed to take care of his family and his. And so like, but the plans that they have for areas like that, Bagley and Fitzgerald and other neighborhoods, they don't include young men like Hakeem. They include the interests of property owners and people who, want to take advantage of Black space, because Black space is only valuable when white people want it. Because think about it, this is a neighborhood too, like quite a few neighborhoods on the west side of Detroit, where you have working class and middle class Black wealth, but like you still had these property values depreciate. And it only starts appreciating in value, when white people decide that they want to live there, or that they have some kind of designs on owning property and renting there. And, so.
We have a bunch of good questions. I'm going to shut up and I'm going to ask these questions. The first one though is, who's Dan Freeman? Dan Freeman is the protagonist in The Spook Who Sat by the Door. So that's both in book form and in film. So make sure you check it out. It's excellent. Okay, let me get to the next one. I thought there was this is a question. I thought there was an eviction moratorium due to COVID-19. Is it even legal that the police are evicting people?
So first of all, I feel like this came from a white person. The police do whatever the fuck they want to do when they want to do it in black neighborhoods. Let me just say that. They do whatever the fuck they want to do and they get away with it most of the time. But there was a moratorium in Detroit. Yes. It ended, I believe. When did it end? I don't know. I don't know when it ended, but there's no longer a moratorium. What they did instead was announce, like an allotment of money that was supposed to go towards making sure that every Detroiter that was facing an eviction was able to get that paid for. But in the case of Miss Bernie, so there's a lot of great questions that I want to respond to, so I'm going to be short. But in the case of Miss Bernie, her landlord just called the police and said that she was a squatter, right? So they get around, like, in the face. When we say, like, the state has to solve these problems, the state has to solve them. They can't provide wiggle room. They can't, say, oh, we're giving the funds. All people need to do is put their name down. No, they have to, like, come down hard with outright policies to fix these problems. So Miss Bernie is, her landlord is a registered sex offender. He starts making sexual advances on her. She denies them. And ultimately, after months of harassing her, he calls the police and says that there's a squatter living on his property. And so the police come in. They obviously see that it's not the case. In fact, it's a woman and her 4 children, and they have furniture and clothes, but they don't give a fuck because they can do whatever they want to do because they're the police and they get away with it. So they evict her. They make her and her kids pack up. But yeah, so the answer to that is yes and no. There was a moratorium. The city of Detroit announced funds to solve that problem. But as we see, that those funds did not solve those problems for everybody. And what it did was create space for predatory landlords, for police, for anybody who wanted to operate in the way that they were constrained during an outright moratorium.
Okay, we have a question here that's near and dear to me, and I want to address this because Yusuf mentioned that I too kind of work for a nonprofit. I work for Wayne State University, and I want to give a story about this because it leads up to the next question, and it's related to kind of like mental health and the role that police play in mental health. There's a few things I want to say about my university that I think are important, and I want all the students here to think about, like, what you could do locally, right? A good friend of mine, Austin McCoy, used to be a student leader at University of Michigan, for example. And if you want to carry forward his work, I just wanted to kind of give you the scope of kind of like the critical importance that universities play in policing, right? And in racist policing, right? So at our school, Wayne State University, we have 20,000 surveillance cameras on campus, right? That while they might claim that they don't have access to facial recognition technology, they're also, because it's part of the city of Detroit, they go down to the real-time crime center in Detroit and are subject to facial recognition either through the city of Detroit, if not themselves, and through the Michigan State Police, right? And this should be troubling because they're not only in public spaces outdoors, the majority of those cameras are in buildings, right? To me, these are clear violations of the Fourth Amendment, right? Illegal searches, right? So we should be clear that universities have a vested interest in the project of gentrification, and the project of gentrification is directly connected to the project of policing and hyper-policing. I bring all this up to say that, like, you might know that when you drive down the Lodge Freeway, if you're from here, you'll see a stretch of the Lodge that is called the Colin Rose freeway. And he was a young officer who was associated with the Wayne State Police Department, right? And he was killed on the job. And I bring this up because his death was tragic, right? And it was tragic, but I don't think for the reasons that a lot of people realize. Wayne State, as part of the gentrification project in part of Midtown, polices well beyond the boundaries of the university, right? And prided itself on doing so as a means to attract white people and Black middle-class people to make them feel safe in the area around Wayne State. And so what that means is that they're hyper-policing the areas around them, which are predominantly Black and predominantly low income. And just to kind of further conceptualize this, Wayne State also runs what's known as the CompStat program for Detroit police. And for those that aren't aware of CompStat, CompStat is the foundation of William Bratton's Broken Windows police system, right? Broken Windows policing, which is most associated with the city of New York, and which cases led by the ACLU have been found unconstitutional for Fourth Amendment purposes, right? But the Detroit police still practices this policy of broken windows policing, and they use this data collected to do so. And that data is processed at Wayne State University by the Center for Urban Studies, right? So my university is directly complicit in the hyper policing of Black communities in and around the institution. And why is that important? It's important because the university owns property in those areas, and it behooves them to increase their profitability by helping with the hyper policing that surrounds them, right? So I want to make this clear. And Colin Rose was killed responding to something across the Lodge Freeway off campus. And what he was responding to was an incident in which somebody who was mentally ill, right, didn't receive the care they needed, and instead the call went to police. And right, so when threatened, of course, by police, this person responded and killed Colin Rose. And that's tragic. He should have never been killed, right? He should have never been killed because he should have never been over there. And because CompStat shouldn't be run by a university, right? And that communities shouldn't be surveilled and policed in such a way as to facilitate profits for landowners, whether they be for profit or nonprofit. So I just want to give that a local flavor before I raise the following question. And this is from comrades, I believe, in Rochester, New York. And they ask, what are your thoughts on police responding to people in mental health crises? How can we increase access to mental health services for Black folks? And I would say this, not just for Black folks, for anybody who needs it. Damn it, for all the people in Detroit or Rochester, right? Rather than police being the first call of response. Oh shit, now we got silence.
You got to defund the police. Listen, I mean, there's the funds have to come from somewhere, right? And the truth is that mental illness is not it's not a new phenomenon, right? It's something that has existed for a really long time. And so, but what also has existed for a really long time is Black and brown people and poor people not having access to healthcare. So you come to anything that my family is throwing, there's a bunch of fucking people that are clearly mentally ill, right? But we know how to deal with them. We know how to talk them down. We know how to handle them with care, right? And none of us are trained professionals. Now you imagine what goes on in hospitals, in crisis centers, where you got nurses and doctors and social workers and psychologists who are not armed, who are dealing with people struggling with these issues. And so it's a question of funding, and like resources being deployed instead of people who are not very highly educated or trained at all, and who have no de-escalation tactics, and who use like brutal force as their first response to everything. So there's the instance of the young man who was wielding the sword, and they released that as like, oh, we had to kill him. We had to kill him. The truth is, if you watch that video with a close eye, the officer walks up, sees a man who's clearly in the middle of a psychotic attack, and immediately points his gun at him and is screaming. And there was no attempt to de-escalate or to talk to him or to mitigate that situation at all. And so when that is your response to everything is force and brutality, then it's ultimately going to lead in someone's death. There's no other alternative. It's serious bodily harm or death. I know we got a couple of minutes, but I want you to can I respond to?
Please.
So you guys kind of got it. We're here to talk to you, but you got to do some of the work yourself, right? So I see a comment that says like, you know, I understand the point that nonprofits can't replace the state, but I do think it does depend on a lot of the nonprofits, since some focus heavily on policy in addition to their advocacy work. In this way, they can play both the role of assisting affected individuals as well as pushing for change. So that's a nice thought. But we just said Detroit has more nonprofits than anywhere in the world. We also just said that Detroit ranks number 6 in this nation for settling police brutality cases. We also just said that in the height of the pandemic, something like 50% of Detroiters didn't have jobs. We also just said 30% of the kids just didn't engage at all. The nonprofits didn't solve that issue. And it's because, one, not only do they not have the capacity to, like, these nonprofits are not gonna save anybody's life. It's nice to be able to get, like, when they're giving out $500, when they're giving out meals, that shit matters. It's really important to a whole bunch of people, but ultimately, it is not systematic change, which is what is actually needed in our communities. So while it feels really good to be a part of, I work for a nonprofit. I mean, while it feels really good to be a part of those efforts, you also have to understand that you just heard from 4 generations. I mean, you know, Goldberg is as old as he is. Yusuf.
All right, folks, we got to go now.
Yusuf grew up in the 80s. Lloyd grew up in the 90s. I grew up in the 2000s. So you just heard from all of us that really and truly conditions haven't changed that much. And in fact, in a lot of ways, they've gotten worse throughout the years. And so if these nonprofits were solving these problems for us, the Black Lives, we wouldn't have just had the largest social movement in the history of the United States. So you got to kind of do some of the work, just like, you know, and the people who engage in that work are doing it, most of them with good intentions, and they want to make immediate change. But the truth is that there's no substitution for the role of the state in systematic and institutional change.
I would like to reiterate that just for a second, in the sense that, like, you know, we have a bunch of nonprofits that are dealing with the issue of housing right now, and they're so overtaxed and understaffed because they don't have adequate resources, right? But beyond that, like, those that are heavily funded, I think most importantly, right, are those, one of the things about nonprofits is it takes away an element of transparency, right? It kind of like eliminates kind of the democratic process in terms of how public issues are being looked at. Yusuf, did you want to chime in?
Yeah, I believe you opened this up, using language such as reimagine. If you're not have the ability to reimagine what this world will be like, then any and everything that's been said is going to go over your head. It's not going to make any sense to you. The fact that we have been conditioned. We have been conditioned to accept nonprofits. We've been conditioned to accept policing as a way of life. You have to unlearn what you know to learn what you don't know, to see things in a different way. You know, even though I'm pretty sure all you guys are very critical thinkers, but the question is critical thinkers for what purpose and what intent? In America, we're taught what to think instead of how to think. Every year, there's a level of politicians, you know, we need to be tough on crime. We need to be tougher on crime. That is a every year campaign. If that's the case, then, you know, why America hasn't solved the crime issue is driven a part of capitalism. But we cannot not overstand capitalism tied to the racialized issue of, you know, Black people. of brown people. You know, the dip with brown people going through with deportation, with immigration, what black people are going through in mass incarceration. They're tied together. Again, giving myself an example, I went to prison for 9 years. For 9 years, the state paid for close to $40,000 a year for 9 years. You know, for you know, even I didn't do the crime. Say, you know, it was assault attempt to rob unarmed. Prison didn't rehabilitate me. No, prison didn't make me want to not, when you come out your fucking your dorm, not want to knock you upside your head and rob you. Prison did not do that. My father did. My father helped me begin to see things different, to help transform my mind. So prison is a temporary fix. But understanding again, I live right next door to you guys. That know who those who go to like a Wayne State and shit. Wayne State police is my neighborhood. They don't police it for the good of the nature of out of their heart. They police because we don't want you Negroes to come over across the tracks. We're going to let our presence be felt. Also identify, you know, there's a contradiction. I work for a nonprofit. However, in my space as a nonprofit, I show up the way I'm showing up here. But again, it can be seen as the angry black man, right? Because that's what we've been taught to look at and see. Because we shouldn't have the right to speak up. We shouldn't have the right to advocate. We shouldn't have the right to organize. And I would challenge many of you guys, if you haven't seen, to go watch the movie Judas and the Black Messiah, about the Black Panther, or the chapter of the Black Panther Party, and Fred Hampton, who was murdered in his sleep by the local authorities who have been drugged. I mean, a lot of those things in our mind that we can't comprehend. That is the American government. You know, we you know, some of you guys have learned about Nelson Mandela, who spent 20 years in a South African prison. There's folks here in America, black folks who fought for where we at today, who spent over 30, 40, 50 years in prison, who are political prisoners. We're not taught about that. We're said that they're actual criminals. Their act was fighting for liberation. So it's just being able to expand our minds. So again, you know, you have to be able to reimagine and ask the right questions, because it's about privilege. You know, and privilege it works in different ways. And nonprofits, for the most part, is a privileged game. Again, I mean, those of us who have the most degrees, who have the greatest resource or relationships, or have the access to the greatest resources.
Thank you, Yusuf. I want to close. That was a good place to close, but I want to close with just one comment, and for you all to think about as we go forward here. You know, we started out with this notion of public health, and I want to remind you, you know, that we have to get to the root. And I think, you know, that's the problem with kind of nonprofits, right? In the sense that that's what we're facing, right? But that's not ultimately the solution. And I'm saying that as somebody that works in one, right? So we have to go beyond what presently exists in order to fully address these issues and to deal with them epidemiologically, right? Rather than on a surface level, and rather than in a way that just provides more funds to people that oppress us. And I'll end with this, like Joseph Biden, who some people might think is kind of the solution to these problems, right? And his government is talking about, you know, what happened at the Capitol. And now they're all of a sudden putting forward money to deal with political extremism. And I want to be very careful about language, right? Because they mentioned political extremism. They didn't say white supremacy. They said political extremism. And if you have any background in studying Black history, you should note that money was funded to deal with political extremism during the 1960s, as well as before, of course. And they did go after George Lincoln Rockwell of the Nazi Party, but the majority of that money was spent instituting a program known as COINTELPRO, right? And was geared towards attacking Black people, right, who had visions of liberation, right? And so we have to be very mindful of this and to study and to follow where this money is being spent. One of the most interesting elements of this program that's being funded to deal with political extremism is that the money is going to go directly to police forces, and particularly the FBI, in cities, right? That should be a tell right there, right, as to who they're going to be looking at. And we have to protect people who are fighting for freedom. And to protect them, you have to get out there. You can't blog about it. You can't tweet about it. You got to put some skin in the game here, right? And I'm talking to white people as well as black people that this isn't a white or black issue. This is about liberation. Yusuf mentioned before how black liberation is oftentimes seen as a struggle, or anti-white, right? But the point is that we can't be liberated until all of us are liberated, and those that are super exploited are, have their issues looked after. And we have to join that struggle so we could benefit from that struggle and achieve actual liberation and actual public health. I thank you all for your time, and it's a pleasure to be here tonight. Thank all the panelists too, and all those beautiful dogs. Lloyd, Nakia, Yusuf, it was a pleasure having you, and everyone else, we'll see you next time. Take care.
We go out.
Let me know when we can talk.
It's still live.
All right, we're good. Thank you all.